Talk a little bit about a video that I think a lot of people have watched, and I've seen some comments on it. This is Mike Maloney came out with this video on basically it's what's it called, the greatest secret. I forgot the name of it. I'm gonna look it up again. I just had it up here, but I watched part of one of the biggest scam in the history of mankind. Is the series, and there's one up there, and it's really getting into the Federal Reserve and money and inflation. And while I have, a lot of sympathy for a lot of the things that Mike Maloney is talking about, I just want to talk about one thing where I really disagree with him, and I think he does a disservice to try to make this point, because it really feeds in to the conspiratorial, the conspiracy theories, which I think, undercuts some of our credibility. And the idea that he's making is that the reason that we have an income tax is so that we can pay interest to the Federal Reserve. That the only reason we're paying income taxes is to pay interest to the Federal Reserve, and if we didn't have the Federal Reserve, we wouldn't have an income tax. And the reason he ties the two together, and it's not just Mike Maloney, but other people have made this mistake, is they say, oh, the income tax and the Federal Reserve Act were both enacted as 1913. Therefore, they came in together. The Congress would pass them both because they needed one, right? Once they had the Federal Reserve, they needed the income tax. That's not true, right? The income tax was originally created in 1896, and it was declared unconstitutional. So the Congress had the idea for an income tax long before 1913. And they had one. The Supreme Court struck it down. This is before the Federal Reserve was even contemplated. So then they proposed the 13th Amendment. I think they proposed it in 1909. It didn't get ratified until 1913. So the reason the income tax was adopted in 1913 is because that's when the 16th Amendment was finally ratified, 4 years after it was first proposed. But a long time after the income tax of 1896 was created. So it's got nothing to do with the Federal Reserve Act that was passed in 1913 as well. That's just a coincidence that those two acts happen to be passed in the same year. And also, if you remember that when the Federal Reserve was first created, Federal Reserve notes were backed 60% by gold. The Federal Reserve was not even allowed to buy treasuries. So the whole idea that the income tax was created so that the Treasury could pay interest to the Federal Reserve is nonsense, because the Treasury wasn't paying any interest to the Federal Reserve in 1913 because the Federal Reserve wasn't allowed to own any U.S. Treasuries. And, of course, the income tax revenue that was generated by the income tax was small. Hardly anybody paid the income tax in 1913. It was a millionaire tax, and then it was a 1%, 2% tax. It was small. The income tax was enacted to reduce tariffs. That's why it came in. It had nothing to do with the Federal Reserve at all. Yet now you've got a lot of people trying to tie the two together to try to create some kind of hatred to the Federal Reserve based on the fact that we don't like income taxes. And so you got guys trying to say the reason we have an income tax is because we have a Federal Reserve. And if we just got rid of the Federal Reserve, we wouldn't need the income tax. None of that is true. In fact, if you look at the interest that the government is currently paying to the Fed on its portfolio of treasuries, it's small. I mean, the total interest that the U.S. government is paying on all the Treasury securities is about $250 billion. That's it. So maybe of that, maybe it's paying $50 billion a year to the Federal Reserve, of which much of that is recycled back to the Treasury, because the Federal Reserve is only allowed to earn a small profit on its assets. Anything above that, it pays a 100% tax to the Treasury. So a lot of the interest that the that the Treasury Department pays to the Federal Reserve is paid back to the Treasury by the Federal Reserve. Now, the amount of money that we pay in income taxes, I forget off the top of my head, is it $500 billion a year, $600 billion, $700 billion? I mean, the amount of income tax that we pay dwarfs the amount of interest that Congress pays to the Federal Reserve. So to try to say that the income tax is just there to pay interest to the Federal Reserve is nonsense. And I think when people try to make that ridiculous argument, we lose credibility for the people who oppose the income tax and the Federal Reserve like I do. It allows us to look like conspiratorial nuts. Look, we're ignoring the facts because it's obviously blatantly false. Look, there's plenty of reasons not to like the Federal Reserve. There's plenty of reasons not to like the income tax. So we don't have to make any up. We don't have to make up reasons that aren't true and then give our opponents a avenue to label us as kooks and fools by pointing out the obvious fallacy of that argument. So criticize the Federal Reserve for the things the Fed does wrong and criticize the income tax. There's so many things wrong with the income tax. There's so many legitimate problems with the income tax, both from a constitutional perspective, from a legal perspective, from a moral perspective, from an economic perspective. There's so much wrong with it. We don't need to pretend that we only have the income tax because we have the Federal Reserve. And there's so much wrong with the way the Federal Reserve is currently operating, right? With the money that it's creating, with the problems that we have in the economy because of the Fed, because of the continuous money printing, because of the artificially low interest rates. There's so much legitimately wrong with the Fed, we don't have to make something up. We don't have to try to make it even more sinister than it is by linking the income tax with the Federal Reserve, by trying to say that they're one and the same, that it was a big conspiracy from day one, because all that does is it makes us look ridiculous. Now, I don't know why Maloney fell into that trap. A lot of other people have. I mean, it doesn't have to be this sinister. And, of course, you can't simply promise that if we get rid of the Federal Reserve, we'll have no income tax. That's not going to happen. If we don't want an income tax, it's not just the Federal Reserve we got to get rid of, but a lot of government. We need to slash government spending on other things if we don't want an income tax. And I'm in favor of those massive cuts in government spending so we can liberate the country from the income tax. But, of course, I'd like to liberate the country from the income tax and the Federal Reserve, but that's going to take a lot of political will. We're going to have a big change in Washington before we can make that possible.